Which part of my family? You know what I mean? You know, my mom, she gonna call me O'Shea.
Okay, because that's the name she gave you.
Yeah, that's my name. That's the name she gave me. She gave me a Irish last name. I don't know why.
Ice Cube has spent decades speaking about the world with honesty. But the truth about his own life at 56 is something he never imagined he would have to face. Behind the confidence and the strong public image, there is a story filled with emotional challenges, family pain, and a tragedy that shaped him in ways most fans never realized. This is a side of Ice Cube that is rarely seen, and it deserves to be understood. The world still saw Ice Cube as the unshakable figure from the posters. Brows clenched, jaw tight, eyes that looked like they had seen every corner of the city and memorized its shadows. To most people, he was frozen in time, like an image printed on the inside of their memories. But the man behind that stare was getting older, and the spaces between headlines had become more fragile than anyone could guess. There were quiet doctor visits that never made the news, small medical scares that started as just a checkup and turned into long conversations about numbers, charts, and risk. There were days when a wave of fatigue hit him in the middle of a meeting, and he caught himself staring at a bottle of water, wondering when the simple act of staying upright had become work. He was not broken, but he was no longer bulletproof, and for the first time, he was starting to feel the distance between the myth and the body that had to carry it. At home, the atmosphere had shifted in ways he could feel before anyone spoke. His family had grown up, spread out, lived their own lives, and then circled back around the house in complicated orbits. Children had become adults with their own stubbornness and their own scars. They were no longer little kids looking up at him from the couch. They were people with opinions, frustrations, and memories of his absence that they carried quietly. Conversations that used to end in laughter now sometimes ended with heavy silence or a door closing more firmly than it needed to. Texts went unanswered a little longer. Calls were sometimes returned a day late. He carried guilt for the years spent in studios and trailers instead of bleachers and school auditoriums. No one had to say the words aloud. He felt the weight of missed moments in the way his kids paused before they spoke, in the way his partner looked at him when he checked his phone in the middle of dinner. There had been losses too, real, cutting losses that rearranged the air in a room. Funerals where he kept his sunglasses on longer than he needed, not to hide from cameras, but to hold himself together. Memorial services where old friends hugged him with that look that says more than any speech. Loss crept into his life in ways that did not make headlines. A cousin gone too soon, a friend who had been there since the earliest mixtapes, an elder whose advice he still heard in his head at random times of the day. He would drive home from those gatherings along familiar streets that suddenly felt strangely empty. Sometimes one of his own songs would come on the radio, and it was like hearing a younger version of himself sending messages forward through time. The anger, confidence, and rawness in that voice felt like they belonged to another man. The grief he was carrying now was quieter, heavier, and not easily turned into verses. Professionally, the machine around him never stopped moving. There were still emails, contracts, pitches, notes to review, and ideas landing on his desk like a constant rain. Even if he wanted to slow down, the world around him pushed him to keep up. Meetings happened in sleek rooms where everyone spoke fast and smiled even faster. People used phrases about brands, leverage, universes, and synergy, but under all of it were the same old questions. What could his name still do, and how much was it worth? The industry that had built him into a giant had shifted underneath his feet. Albums had given way to streams, and now streams fought with social media clips that flickered in and out of existence in a day. Younger artists came up calling him OG with genuine respect that still stung in its own way. It was a compliment and a gentle reminder that the culture now viewed him as part of history, even while he was still trying to live in the present. He was respected, quoted, imitated, and studied, but respect came with its own shadow. The shadow was a quiet pressure that suggested he was supposed to stand back a little now. Step aside, let the next generation handle the center of the stage, smile for the tributes, and accept the lifetime awards. He felt that expectation everywhere, in interview questions framed in past tense, in articles that folded his name into sentences about pioneers and foundations. He knew what he had built. He was proud of it, but something in him refused to stand in a museum version of his life while he was still breathing. He still had ideas that woke him up in the middle of the night. Film concepts scribbled on sticky notes, lines of dialogue and fragments of lyrics that floated through his head when the house was quiet. Every new project took more out of him, both physically and emotionally, because each one felt like another test. Proof that he still belonged, that he could still move people, that he was not just a name from a different era. Outside of studios and meeting rooms, the larger world had grown louder and meaner. Social media blurred the line between audience and mob. Every opinion exploded into a spectacle. Ice Cube had never been the type to sit in a corner and play it safe. Over the years, he spoke his mind about politics, power, injustice, and betrayal, and he did it in the same blunt voice that once shook entire neighborhoods. But the landscape was different now. When he spoke, the reaction did not come just from critics and fans. It came from people who had never listened to an album, never watched a film, never known the full journey, but felt entitled to decide his character in a few sentences. There were days when a single comment rolled into a storm by morning. Supporters praised him for honesty, while others painted him as misguided, dangerous, confused, or opportunistic. He had been here before, in a different shape. Controversy was not new to him. What was new was the speed and reach of it. Years ago, someone had to buy a magazine, turn on a TV, or show up at a show to see his name. Now, one headline could travel around the world in 10 minutes and land on his children's phones before he could even respond. That was what made this era feel different. The criticism did not only land on him, it landed on people who carried his last name or his blood. A stranger online could say something cruel and move on with their day, but his family had to live with the echo. Sometimes he would sit at the kitchen table long after everyone had gone to bed, swiping through posts he knew he should ignore, feeling the strange mixture of defiance and exhaustion that came from refusing to bend, but still wondering in the quiet part of his mind about the cost. His health became a subtle undercurrent in everything, a storyline that did not belong on camera but was impossible to ignore. He did not announce every ache or share every test result. That was not who he was. But the reality waited for him in simple details. The way he moved slower getting out of bed, the stiffness in his knees on cold mornings, the fatigue that lingered after long days on set or in the studio. Where he once shrugged off late nights and early mornings, now his body demanded repayment. Friends, colleagues, even family members urged him to take it easy. They said it with a joking tone sometimes, but the concern in their eyes gave it away. He had watched too many people in his community ignore the warning signs and then vanish. In his most honest moments, alone, he admitted to himself that he was afraid, not of aging, but of running out of time without healing the things he had left unresolved. Through all of this, there was a line inside him that had never moved. He still felt responsible for the kid he used to be. The one who walked through streets where sirens were normal background noise and broken glass on the sidewalk caught sunlight like jewelry. That kid had looked out at a world that did not care whether he lived or died. So when Ice Cube funded youth programs, sat down with community organizers, or showed up quietly to check on a project that would never trend, it was that young version of himself he had in mind. Those efforts almost never made it into the spotlight. Reporters preferred drama, conflict, and sound bites that could spark arguments. The slow work of trying to keep kids away from gangs or giving them a safe place to hoop did not sell as easily. But those were the moments that mattered to him in a stubborn, personal way. He thought often about legacy, not in the sense of awards or lists, but in the sense of what happened to those neighborhoods he never fully left behind. He had seen entire blocks change. He watched small stores that used to let kids run up a tab close their doors. He saw rent go up so high that people who had grown up on those streets could not afford to stay there. It tore at him to realize that some of the places immortalized in his lyrics had become unrecognizable, not because they had healed, but because people had been pushed out. The heartbreak for him lived not just in personal loss, but in watching old battles repeat themselves with new faces. Young artists rapped about the same pain in different slang, the same violence under new headlines. Sometimes he felt like he was standing at a window watching history walk in circles. At home, he tried to repair what could still be repaired. Large gestures came easily to a successful man: vacations, gifts, opportunities. But he was beginning to understand that what his family needed most were the small and steady things. They needed him not as Ice Cube, but as a father, a partner, a brother, a son. They needed him at the dinner table with his phone face down, in the living room, listening without turning every moment into a lesson. There were awkward evenings where the television was on, but no one was really watching, where they all edged around real topics. The first few honest conversations were rough. Raised voices, old wounds pulled into the light, pauses that stretched long and uncomfortable. Yet those talks, as painful as they were, meant that people in his life still cared enough to fight for understanding instead of walking away. He apologized more than he used to. Sometimes the words came out stiff, bumping against pride and habit. Other times they came out softer and easier, as if they had been waiting for years. His kids were old enough now to push back. They told him directly when something he said reminded them of an earlier pain, when a promise went unkept, when his public battles overshadowed their private struggles. Those conversations cut deep. He had built a career on speaking hard truths to the world outside, but it was different when those truths came from across the same kitchen table. In those moments, legend status did not matter. Only the man did. Late at night, when the house finally quieted and the city outside his windows softened to a low hum, he would find himself alone with old notebooks. Some were falling apart at the edges, pages yellowed and creased. They held fragments of lines, half-formed ideas, pieces of poems never meant for anyone else's ears. Reading them was like opening letters from a younger self. The voice in those pages was raw, sharp, and certain that the world needed to be confronted, not negotiated with. He did not envy that younger man's anger, but he did envy the simplicity of his focus. Back then, his life had been messy and dangerous, but his purpose was clear. Now, every decision moved through layers of responsibility, to his family, to his businesses, to his body, to a legacy that others tried to define for him. That was the quiet heartbreak of this stage of his life. Not just the funerals, not just the doctor visits, not just the misunderstandings played out in public. It was the constant negotiation between who he had been and who he was allowed to be now. Fans wanted the same fire from 30 years ago, but also demanded softness, enlightenment, and flawless decisions in a world more complicated than ever. People called him a legend, then asked him to act like he was already gone. The culture he helped shape moved fast, always hungry for the next voice, the next face, the next headline. He stood in the middle of it all, a man trying to honor the boy he had been, protect the family he had built, and still speak honestly in a time when honesty could burn everything down. In that narrow space, between the public image and the private reality, was where his days now lived. Every morning, he had to decide what to carry and what to set down, when to step forward and when to fall back, when to hold the line and when to admit that the person he was at 20 is not the person he can be at 56. He had given his whole adult life to telling uncomfortable truths about America, about power, about black life, about survival. Now the hardest truths were turned inward. He was no longer just asking what the world had done to him and his people. He was asking what his choices had done to the people closest to him, and what he was willing to do, while there was still time, to make things right. He remembered the hum of fluorescent lights, the rustle of paper on the exam table. A nurse wrapped a cuff around his arm and told him to relax. Another person in scrubs walked in and out with a laptop, typing as they asked questions. Sleep, stress, diet, family history. The words blurred together, familiar but distant. He had seen this scene play out with relatives before. Different faces, same script. They drew blood, checked his heart, and took pressure readings. He joked lightly to keep the mood from dipping too low. The staff smiled, some shyly acknowledging who he was. But when the doctor walked back in and sat down with a slower, heavier posture, the temperature in the room seemed to shift. The doctor did not say anything dramatic. There was no life or death headline in the first sentence. Instead, there were numbers: blood pressure high, certain markers off, stress levels too elevated for too long. There was talk about risk, long-term, if this continues, and we need to take this seriously. The words were measured and careful, but the meaning cut through clearly. The life he had lived at full speed, fueled by adrenaline, pressure, and purpose, had left marks on the inside that no one could see on a movie poster. A younger version of him might have shrugged it off, called it nothing, walked out, and gone straight back to work. At 56, with funerals still fresh in his memory, he heard it differently. It was not a sentence. It was a warning, a quiet but firm reminder that even the strongest walls eventually crack if they are never allowed to rest. On the way home, Los Angeles moved around him like it always did. Traffic grinding forward, palm trees leaning in the same lazy posture against the sky, billboards flashing with the latest faces and releases. But he saw it all through a different lens. He passed by an old neighborhood, the kind of block where he used to lean against cars and plot verses with friends who were gone now. A memory hit him of running up and down those same sidewalks without ever thinking about blood pressure, cholesterol, or sleep. Back then, danger had a face, a sound, a location. Now it sat quietly in his chest and veins, in habits and long nights, in the steady drumbeat of obligations that never seemed to slow down. He pulled into his driveway later than planned, the sun already fading. His house, with its warm lights and familiar shapes, felt both comforting and distant. Inside, life was moving. Someone laughing in another room, a TV murmuring low, a phone buzzing on a counter. He stepped in, closed the door behind him, and stood there for a moment in the entryway, letting his eyes adjust. A small pile of shoes waited by the wall. An old jacket of his hung on a hook, faded at the sleeves. The world might have known him as Ice Cube, but here, none of that made the dishes wash themselves or the tension in the air disappear. Here he was, just the man, the father, the partner, the relative who had not always been there as often as everyone wished. He did not announce what the doctor had said that night. Instead, he moved through the house like he was testing the temperature of the water with his foot, sat on the edge of the couch, watched a bit of whatever was on, listened to his family talk about their days. There was a warmth in the room, but also an invisible line of distance that only long careers can create. They were used to him leaving, used to him stepping out for calls, used to him nodding along with half his attention somewhere else. He caught himself reaching for his phone out of habit and forced his hand back down to his leg. The conversation drifted around work, schools, friends, random gossip, traffic, and a funny video someone had seen. He laughed, added a comment here and there, felt both inside the moment and slightly outside of it. But the words started to feel thin as he spoke them, because he could hear what they were not saying outright. They were afraid he would burn out, afraid that one day all the pressure and noise would hit a limit his body could not push past. Afraid that the man they were still learning and relearning, now as adults, might not be around long enough to finish the conversations they had only just begun. Something in him softened. He told them, in plain language, what the doctor had said. No sugarcoating, no dramatics. For a moment, the room went quiet. Their eyes flicked to his chest, to his face, as if searching for signs of what might be happening under the surface. Then they reminded him, with all the sincerity in the world, that awards and deals did not matter if he did not live long enough to enjoy them. From that moment, the question of how he lived each day stopped being abstract. It was not just about his grind, his drive, his identity as a man who never let up. It was about birthdays still to come, grandkids he might one day hold, games he could still watch from the stands, and simple afternoons where nothing important happened except the fact that they were together. Change did not come overnight. He did not transform into a different person, but little by little, he started redrawing the lines. He said no more often, not just to random requests, but to big, tempting opportunities that would have eaten up months. He cut out some late-night runs to the studio, moved sessions earlier in the day when he could. He scheduled real breaks, not the fake kind where you work from your phone in a different room. He started paying more attention to what went on his plate, even if that meant wrestling with comfort food that tasted like childhood. It was not about image. He was not the type to post salad pictures for the internet. It was about control. If there were battles he could not avoid, he at least wanted to walk into them stronger. He watched people dissect decisions he had made behind closed doors, in rooms where no one was filming, with information they did not have. They drew conclusions about his character with a confidence that would have been laughable if it were not so damaging. The hardest part was not that strangers got him wrong. He had been misunderstood for most of his career. The hardest part was when that noise drifted into his house, into conversations with his kids, into the way people looked at his family when they walked through certain spaces. At times, one of his children would show him a comment they stumbled on, anger flickering in their eyes. "Why are they talking like they know you?" they would say. Or, "Why do you even bother saying anything to them?" He did not always have a neat answer. Silence might have been safer. It might have made his days smoother. But staying quiet had never been part of his DNA. From the start, his work came from calling things what they were, from pointing directly at the wound instead of pretending it was not there. The cost of that honesty had always been high. What changed at 56 was not the cost itself, but who had to share it with him. When he was younger, he could absorb the blows himself. As a grown man with a family that carried his last name, every shot thrown at him ricocheted in directions he could not control. There were nights when he sat alone, phone in hand, scrolling through reactions he knew he should not read. He would see an old clip of himself from years back, a quote about injustice or resilience, placed next to his recent statements. Some praised him for staying the same. Others mocked him for not changing enough. The irony was sharp. People wanted him to grow, but only in directions that made them comfortable. They wanted the rebel when it came with vintage footage and retro beats, not when it showed up in real time, challenging alliances and narratives that made them feel safe. Away from the noise, away from the comments and headlines, his day-to-day life had become a balancing act. There was the physical reality of aging, which demanded more respect than he had given it in the past. There was the emotional reality of loss and regret, tied to faces he would never see again. There was the financial and creative weight of running businesses, shepherding projects, and giving opportunities to younger artists and creators who saw him as both a door and a blueprint. And then there was the spiritual question that threaded through all of it. What did it mean to stay true to himself now, not just to the version of himself other people had frozen in place? He found fragments of that answer in small, almost quiet moments. In showing up to a youth program he had helped fund years back, and seeing teenagers on a court that might not have existed without his support. In watching a kid in a faded hoodie take their first steps into a recording booth, nervous and excited, on equipment his investment had paid for. In a text from someone he had worked with long ago, thanking him for a conversation that had turned their life in a different direction. These things were not flashy. They did not go viral, but they anchored him. They reminded him that his worth was not measured only in metrics or mentions. Family remained the most complicated and the most important part of that anchoring. There were days when the house felt warm, full, and easy. Music playing in the background, people talking over each other, someone telling a story that made everyone lean back and laugh from the chest. Then there were days when tension walked through the rooms like a shadow. Old resentments would surface. A comment about the past, tossed off delicately, would crack open a deeper wound. He had to accept, often painfully, that loving his family had not always translated into being there for them the way they needed, especially during the years when he was building an empire out of thin air. He began to listen more, really listen, not like he was preparing a defense or building a case, but like a man who understood that hearing his family's truth did not make his own invalid. They told him about birthdays he missed, ceremonies where his name was on the program, but his seat was empty, days when they watched him celebrated by millions while quietly wishing they had more of him to themselves. They did not say it to break him, but to be honest, it hurt anyway. It also opened a door he had not realized was still locked. He apologized, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes with a rawness that left everyone quiet. He did not try to erase the past with one conversation. He tried, instead, to show up better in the present. Part of his heartbreak in this season of life came from learning that repair is not fast. You cannot simply write a check, host a vacation, or post a loving picture and expect years of distance to vanish. You have to sit in the discomfort of other people's memories and let them breathe. He found himself having one-on-one talks in hallways, over car rides, on porches late at night. A daughter reminding him of something he had forgotten, but she never did. A son telling him how it felt to grow up in the shadow of a legend and still try to define himself. A partner describing the loneliness of holding everything together back home while he was out fighting creative and political wars in the world. Through it all, he realized that being a man, being a father, being a partner at 56 required a different kind of courage than the one that got him here. It was not the courage to stand up to police, labels, or studios. It was the courage to stand still and face himself, to look at the gap between his intentions and his impact, and not flinch, to accept that he had done the best he could with what he knew at the time, and still admit that it had not always been enough. There were moments when the sheer weight of it all pressed down so hard he could feel it in his chest. The lost friends, the health scares, the public misunderstandings, the unfinished repairs at home, the tug of war between the world that wanted him to speak and the family that just wanted him to be there. On those nights, when everyone else was asleep and the house was dark, he would sometimes move through the rooms in silence, touching the back of a chair, the edge of a picture frame, the side of a doorway, taking inventory in a way, not of possessions, but of the life he had actually built. The real one, not the one people argued about online. And yet, underneath the heaviness, something else lived. A small, stubborn flame that refused to go out. It lived in every new idea that still excited him, in every script that made him lean forward, in every beat that made his head nod, in every conversation with a young person who told him his work had saved them in ways he would never fully understand. It lived in the simple joy of waking up and realizing there were still chapters left to write, not just in his career, but in his relationships, in his health, in his understanding of himself. He knew now that the next part of his journey would not be judged by how loud it was, how many headlines it made, or how perfectly it fit anyone's expectations. It would be measured in smaller, quieter victories, choosing rest without feeling like he was betraying his work ethic, speaking up when it mattered most, even if it meant another storm, and staying silent when it was just noise. Showing up to the game, sitting in the stands, and cheering without checking his phone. Calling a family member out of the blue just to ask how they were, without a reason or a crisis attached. Ice Cube at 56 was not a closing chapter. He was a man standing in the middle of his story, holding the weight of everything behind him and the uncertainty of everything ahead, still trying to walk straight. The heartbreak he carried was real, but it did not own him. It sharpened him. It reminded him day after day that nothing about this life was guaranteed. Not the fame, not the health, not the love, not the time. All he could do was honor what he had been given by using whatever days were left with intention. He had spent his youth telling the world hard truths about itself. In this season, the hardest and most important truths were the ones he told himself in the dark when no one else was listening. That he was tired, but not finished. That he was flawed, but not hollow. That he was grieving, but still grateful. That he was afraid of the future, but not running from it. And that somewhere inside the man the world called a legend was still that kid from the neighborhood, looking around, taking notes, promising that as long as he had breath in his body, he would keep speaking for himself, for his people, and for the life that had made him who he was. If you appreciate detailed and emotional stories about the people you grew up watching, make sure you subscribe and tap the bell icon. This ensures you never miss our latest videos and helps our channel continue creating content that matters.